For those of you just joining us, we will begin in 1 minute. Welcome. My name is Piper Chapman, and I am the Assistant Director at Harvard Alumni Travels. Thank you for joining us today for Climate Change Conversations. We've teamed up with our colleagues at Yale Alumni Academy to offer this climate-focused lecture series for our alumni communities. We're fortunate to have a wide range of expert faculty and researchers in the field who will offer a collection of talks over the course of 3 weeks. All of the lectures will be recorded and available to view on the Harvard and Yale websites. Before I turn things over to our distinguished speaker, I'd like to review the format for today's Zoom webinar. For the duration of the lecture, your video and microphone will be turned off and the chat box will be disabled so we can direct our attention to our speaker. On the bottom of your screen, you will see several buttons to interact with. Please insert your questions in the Q&A box, which we will address at the end of our program. Closed captioning is available, and you will find it by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues, please message our support team by selecting support in the chat. Today's 1-hour webinar will be recorded and shared with you. Finally, we appreciate your patience should we experience technological glitches or delays due to the nature of our virtual environment. And please be aware that you can adjust your sound preferences on your personal devices. I am so thrilled to pass this over to Professor Stavins, but first, a brief word about our speaker. Professor Stavins is the A.J. Meyer Professor of Energy and Economic Development, Director of the Harvard Environmental Economics Program and the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is also chairman of Harvard's doctoral programs in public policy and in political economy and government, and chairman of the Kennedy School's joint degree program with Harvard Business School. Professor Stavins' research has focused on diverse areas of environmental economics and policy. Some of his current research includes analyses of international policy alternatives for addressing climate change, technology innovation, and environmental benefit valuation. We are so fortunate to have Professor Stavins with us today to give his lecture, What Can an Economist Possibly Have to Say About Climate Change? Because by next week, he will be in Scotland attending the UN climate negotiations. Rob, we are so fortunate to have you with us today, and I know there is so much to cover, so without further ado, I would love to pass the mic over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Piper. I'm delighted to be here with Harvard and Yale alumni, two marvelous institutions. I understand that Professor Dan Esty from Yale spoke to you just yesterday. He's a longtime colleague and friend. Now, he's a lawyer, and I'm an economist, which is a direct lead-in to what the subject of my talk is. So let me share my screen. And my topic is indeed, what can an economist possibly have to say about climate change policy? The answer to that question may be obvious to a small number of people, at least to economists, but to lots of other people, quite reasonably, it's not so obvious. So, how should I address this question? Well, let me start by telling you a story. Back in the pre-COVID days, which we can all remember, I was flying out of Boston's Logan Airport, and I got on the flight, sat down in my seat, and I got out in front of me a newspaper, a book, some work, a variety of material. And then it became clear that the gentleman who was seated next to me wanted to talk. So maybe you've noticed what I have, that there tend to be two kinds of people who fly. Those who like to have conversations with perfect strangers, and then the rest of us. So I'm very much in that second category. And that was the reason for all that, my material. That was my defense, my periphery. But he was also very skilled at starting conversations, alas. And he did it the way Americans typically do. He said, what business are you in? What do you do for a living? And I did something foolish. I told the truth. I said, well, I'm an environmental economist. And he looked at me and I looked at him, but he didn't follow up. Now, here's this fellow who really wants to have a conversation and he doesn't follow up with anything else. And I surely wasn't going to, because I didn't want to talk in the first place. And then after looking at each other's eyes, essentially, for an interminably long time, it dawned upon me that he had concluded that he had just met a living, breathing oxymoron, an internal contradiction. After all, it's either economics or the environment. It's either the study of environmental science or the study of economics. So what could this phrase environmental economics even mean? So my initial purpose, before I even turned to focusing on climate change policy in just a minute or two, is to explain why environmental economics is not oxymoronic. Indeed, I hope it's much more than that. The first reason is that the causes of environmental problems in a market economy such as we have in the United States and in all but a handful of countries now around the world, the causes are economic. Environmental problems are the unintended side effects, unintended negative side effects of market activity as a result of firms, companies producing goods and services that you and I buy, that we want. They unintentionally produce these environmental consequences through their pollution emissions. And that pollution then, the unintended consequences, are outside of their normal range of decision-making because it doesn't show up in their bottom line. It doesn't show up in either the expenditures or the revenues of the company. So it's external to their decision-making, which is why economists refer to environmental problems as an example of an externality. The other reason is that the consequences of environmental problems have important economic dimensions. Now, surely, if the causes are economic and the consequences have economic dimensions, then an economic perspective can be helpful for developing a full understanding of environmental problems. But I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School, so I'm not interested in understanding just for understanding's sake, but because that full understanding can take us to the design of real-world solutions. Real-world solutions that will be effective scientifically, by which I mean will reduce emissions of pollutants, not simply demonize the bad guys, but actually cause reductions in emissions that will be economically sensible. In the language of economics, that will be cost effective, by which I simply mean that we won't systematically shoot ourselves in the foot by driving up the costs of other things that we care about: reasonably priced food supply, fuels, transportation, and a whole host of products and services that all of us demand and consume, use every day. And perhaps because of this, the policies might be more likely to be politically feasible. Now, that's very general, but this kind of economic thinking is particularly important for the formulation of effective, sensible, and politically feasible climate change policies. And I say that for a very specific reason. In fact, for two reasons, one of which has to do with the spatial science of climate change, and the other with the temporal dimension of climate change. So both of these are going to take us from the science to the economics to the politics and policy. So the spatial one is that greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter if a ton of carbon dioxide comes from Boston or Beijing, it has exactly the same effects on the climate. It doesn't mean the impacts are the same everywhere in the world, but the total amount of impacts and the location of the impacts are completely independent from the location of the emissions. In economic terms, climate change is therefore a global commons problem. And this means something very important economically. It means that any jurisdiction that takes action to reduce its emissions will incur the costs of its actions. And what are those costs? The costs of in generating electricity, switching from coal to petroleum and natural gas to renewables, and possibly to nuclear power. And yet the benefits are going to be distributed globally. So if you just think about that in terms of the basic geographical arithmetic, it means that for virtually any jurisdiction in the world, the direct climate benefits it receives from its actions are going to be a small fraction of the costs that it incurs, despite the fact that the global benefits may be greater, much, much greater than the global costs. And this presents a classic free rider problem, which means that it's in the interest of each jurisdiction not to take action, but to sit back and wait for others and to receive benefits from the actions they take. And that's why international, if not fully global, but international cooperation is essential, which is why in a few days I'll be flying off to Glasgow in Scotland for the annual climate negotiations. And in addition to that, it's why the highest levels of effective governance need to be involved. And the highest levels of effective governance everywhere, with the partial exception of the European Union, are nations. Now, as I said, there's also a temporal dimension to this issue, which again takes us from science to economics to politics and policy. And that is that greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere. The half-life of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is over 100 years. And the damages, that is the degree of climate change, are not a function of the flow, the emissions at any point in time or any year, but of the accumulated stock in the atmosphere. So in other words, it's as if we have a bathtub. The emissions are the water that are pouring into the bathtub, and we've got a very, very, very slow drain. And so the level of the bathtub, the concentrations in the atmosphere, are constantly increasing. So if CO2 emissions actually began falling tomorrow by 5% per year, which would actually be a very dramatic rate, the rate of warming won't begin to change in ways that are actually detectable until well after 20 years. So the greatest benefits of climate policies are going to be in the long term. But climate change policies and the costs that come along with those policies are upfront whenever you put the policy in place. That combination of upfront costs and delayed benefits presents a massive political challenge in representative democracies, because the political incentive in democracies is to give benefits to today's voters and to place the costs on future generations. The climate problem is asking elected politicians to do precisely the opposite, therefore, of what would in that sense be in their interests. So together, the spatial aspect, the global commons nature of the problem, plus its intertemporal asymmetry, make climate change a very, very tough political challenge. Now, economists tend to favor carbon pricing, which is either a tax on the carbon content of fossil fuels or a trading system, often called cap and trade, in which there are assigned carbon rights and the market generates the price. Now, why do economists favor this approach? It's not for ideological reasons, but for very pragmatic ones, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of sources in a modern economy such as the US. There's no other feasible approach that could provide meaningful emission reductions. Also, because the marginal costs vary tremendously across sources, the least costly approach in the short term is with carbon pricing. And in the long term, because these relative prices send important messages to the economy for carbon-friendly technological change. Now, in saying that carbon pricing is necessary, that doesn't mean that it will be sufficient, and there are specific reasons why not. But what are the consequences of carbon pricing? Well, the greatest impacts globally are going to be due on coal. And that's because of the very high carbon content of coal, affecting electricity dispatch immediately, and then long-term impacts on investment in new capacity and long-term impacts on the retirement of existing capacity. Smaller impacts on natural gas, although natural gas also has carbon content, and when it's burned, CO2 emissions occur. But in the short term, we could actually witness, with most kinds of climate policies, an increase in natural gas use, because coal and natural gas in the US and in some other countries are important substitutes for the generation of electricity. And I should say that the likely effects here, even with the substantial carbon price, are small compared with the effects we've already seen, with a massive drop in the price of natural gas because of the development of new unconventional sources of natural gas through the combination of two technologies, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Now, of course, the other key of the three of the fossil fuels is petroleum or oil. And here the impacts would be potentially muted, at least in the short term, because liquid fuels are used largely in the transportation sector. In the United States, they're used exclusively in the transportation sector. And because there are a lack of available substitutes at low cost, it means that the marginal cost of abatement is relatively high. And so actually a cost-effective policy in the short term wouldn't target oil, it would target coal and to some degree natural gas. Now, this is going to change over time as a result of electric vehicles. If the electricity that goes into those electric vehicles is coming from renewable sources, not from fossil fuel generation, and then we will see impacts on oil demand. Now, in terms of thinking about the sectors, it's probably obvious that a carbon price, or again, any kind of climate policy, is going to be bad news for coal, even in the short term, mixed for natural gas, as I said, and in the short term, possibly muted for oil. But it's going to be very good news for renewable sources of energy, principally solar and wind power, and possibly for nuclear, depending upon some political factors. But there's a lot in the economy other than the fossil fuel sector. So what about the rest of the economy? In particular, we might think about manufacturing as well as all of the services. So the climate policies are going to be bad news for sectors that use energy because they're driving up the price of energy. But that's essentially all sectors. But it's not that simple, because these will be particularly bad news for the consumers of energy consuming durable goods. An example, an airline. What makes airlines profitable or not in any year, putting aside these tragic COVID years, is essentially the price of jet fuel. And so when the price of jet fuel goes up, it's bad news for United Airlines. It reduces their profits. But it does something else. It gives them a very large incentive to buy the new generation of aircraft, which are systematically more energy efficient than the previous generations, because aircraft are getting lighter as a result of the use of composite materials rather than metal. So therefore, these approaches and a climate policy can be very good news for producers of those same energy consuming durable goods, like Boeing Airlines, but also General Electric, automobile companies, companies that manufacture off-road equipment, such as Caterpillar. And indeed, if you look at who supports and who doesn't support climate policies, rather than thinking it's all a matter of the ethics of the CEO, it's a matter of whether or not the climate policy is working against the profitability of that company or in favor of it. And you have to look at each individual sector to figure that out. Now, just to put some numbers on this, carbon pricing exists in many parts of the world. There are emissions trading regimes that are significant in the European Union, in New Zealand, in New England, in California, Korea. China's putting a system in place this year, just started in the summer. We'll have to see how that goes. There are also carbon taxes in many parts of the world. And then many jurisdictions are not going to employ carbon pricing at all. They'll use some kind of performance standards or conventional technology standards. Less cost effective. They'll be even more costly. There's still a shadow price, as economists call it, on carbon, but it's not as visible. Now, to look at this graphically, there are currently 61 carbon pricing systems in place around the world. About half are carbon taxes and half are trading. You'll notice that the carbon tax is what I put as the carbon price on the vertical axis, which is either the level of the tax or the allowance price generated by the market in a cap and trade regime, and then the scope of coverage of the system on the horizontal axis. So some carbon taxes are at much higher levels than cap and trade allowance prices. Carbon taxes are in blue. The emissions trading is in green. This is the outlier, which is Sweden. But if you want to see which is more important, we'll combine the stringency, the price, with the scope, the coverage, multiply these two. In other words, the area of the rectangles. And you'll see there's more green than blue. And so cap and trade is the more important application as of now of the two. I'm not saying it'll be that way for the future, but as of now, that's the reality. All told, this adds up to about 15% of global CO2 emissions. But this doesn't include the Chinese system. China accounts as the largest emitter in the world. It has been since 2006 when they surpassed the United States. They account for about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's CO2 equivalent, the CO2e. And now if their emissions trading system eventually covers half of their emissions, which is what they're aiming for the midterm, then what is that going to mean? Well, that would double this coverage, so it would be twice as large as this. So you can see the Chinese system is exceptionally important. But what about the United States? Well, as I'm sure you all know, we have a new administration in the United States. But what you may not know is that this new U.S. administration, at least in this policy realm, faces some extremely significant challenges. So former President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement. And on Inauguration Day, President Biden initiated the process of rejoining the Paris Agreement. And 1 month later, on February 19th, the U.S. was again a party to the Paris Agreement, which is the standing international agreement governing climate change. But that was the easy part. The hard part was producing a new nationally determined contribution, or NDC, which is a statement under the Paris Agreement of how and how much U.S. greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced by the year 2030. This is challenging because the new NDC had to meet, in my view, two necessary conditions. First, it had to be sufficiently ambitious to satisfy domestic Greens, by which I mean environmental advocacy groups and members of the Congress who are pro-environmental protection, which is essentially most, but not all, Democrats, and then a small number of Republicans. And it also would have to satisfy some key countries, in particular our allies in the European Union. At a minimum, it had to be more ambitious than the Obama NDC, which was a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025 below the 2005 level. So what I want to do now quickly is to take a look at the ambition of the Biden NDC, their commitment to Paris, and also of a few other countries. Keep in mind something, that US-China cooperation was, in the Obama years, was extremely important. That's why we got the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, during the Trump-Biden years, it has evolved from cooperation into confrontation on trade, intellectual property, human rights, and international security. And climate change climate change cooperation between the two countries has suffered as a result. So here are the nationally determined contributions of the top emitters. I don't put all of them down, but of the top 18, the interesting ones. And you can see that the new target for Mr. Biden was in fact very ambitious, or is very ambitious compared to the Obama one, a 50 to 52% reduction of CO2 emissions by the year 2030 compared with the year 2005. The European Union has an even more ambitious one than that, although they use a different baseline, and there's a lot of mischief in that, which we can talk about if you're interested in Q&A. And then Japan, Canada, and the United Kingdom, who are the host in Glasgow of the climate talks this year, have also put forward new nationally determined contributions, which everyone's supposed to do every 5 years under the Paris Agreement. Other countries, and China is about to announce theirs, possibly before we finish our time together today, but in any event, within the next 24 to 48 hours. India, Russia, Brazil, and Australia, other very important emitters, have not made new commitments, and it appears that they will not. But the US one is ambitious. And so remember, I said it had to meet two necessary conditions: ambitious enough to satisfy domestic green groups and some key countries, and it does that. So the first of the two necessary conditions has been satisfied. But the other necessary condition is that it has to be credible. And by credible, what I mean is achievable with reasonably anticipated policy actions, not ones that are on a wish list or that we use as talking points or that sound good in speeches, but can reasonably be anticipated policy actions in the real world of US politics, and the procedures we have for passing laws and the procedures we have for putting in place regulations. So the only way that both conditions can be met is really with aggressive new legislation. As you probably know, the Senate requires, in most cases, 60 votes. Democrats control at best 51 with the vice president, unless a particular device is used called budget reconciliation. And this can only apply for certain legislation that actually affects the budget, and still need 51 votes, which is a problem because of Senator Manchin. So the prospects for major comprehensive climate legislation are not very good. But there is non-climate legislation that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and some of that is feasible. We may see this summer another economic, not this summer, this fall, another economic stimulus bill that has a green tinge, if not a fully green hue. The infrastructure bill has in it some elements that are climate friendly, but the more it has in there that's specific to climate, and the more it contains any new tax elements, it goes from being fully bipartisan to partisan. Now, there are also some less ambitious but truly bipartisan possibilities, although the scope and the stringency is much less than certainly Biden's climate plan. And these are largely subsidies. After all, politicians love giving out benefits. They don't like giving out costs. So tax subsidies, cutting tax incentives are always favored. Wind and solar power, we had them before. We're probably going to see them again as part of this so-called reconciliation bill. And then there are a host of others I won't go into just because of time. But this is unlikely to satisfy the demands of the international calls for action, or even a lot of domestic Greens, certainly the advocacy groups, one of which I used to work for full time. So the Biden administration is likely going to have to opt for regulatory approaches, which is what the Obama administration did. But here there are good news and bad news. There are some excellent candidates, include for a rule for going back to the Obama rule to cut methane leaking from wells and pipelines. This is extremely important. New CAFE standards for motor vehicle fuel efficiency, and implementing the Kigali amendments for CFCs, which are very potent greenhouse gases. That's all good news. But let me get to the fact of the reality is that rules require a procedure, whether they're in an executive order or a regulation. There's a lengthy notice and comment period, an extensive record, interagency consultation, and most important, they are subject to litigation. And anyone who is with us who's not from the United States or is unfamiliar with this country, this is an extremely litigious society. And new regulations are now much more likely to be challenged successfully during the Biden years than during the Obama years. And that's because there are 245 Trump-appointed federal judges. That's more than 25% of the entire federal judiciary. And of course, there's this Supreme Court conservative majority of 6-3 votes who really favor a literal reading of statutes, giving much less flexibility to departments and agencies to interpret those statutes as they would like. There's even a possibility that they will modify or overrule what's called the Chevron doctrine, under which for decades now, the courts have deferred to executive agencies when interpreting what Congress intended, if Congress was not perfectly explicit in the legislation, which it seems to essentially never be. So that may have seemed quite negative, so I am determined to end on a positive note. So let me offer two sources of optimism for U.S. policy action. One is the first one, before I even comment on these, is that climate change is a marathon, not a sprint, and a step forward is possible. In fact, the better metaphor for the annual climate negotiations is a relay race. The important thing is that in any given year, we don't drop the baton. It is successfully passed. There are major improvements that are taking place. We'll talk about those, I'm sure, in the Q&A. But in addition to that, you keep in mind that the US, this is the United States of America, and state level policies and actions can be very effective. We have important subnational policies on the West Coast, the Northeast, and to some degree in the upper Midwest, essentially the blue states. And we might find, therefore, that bottom-up national policy continues to evolve implicitly from the Democrat-leaning states, which represent more than half of the US population, and more importantly, much more than half of economic activity and therefore of greenhouse gas emissions. You know, since I comment on Democrats and Republicans, I want to point something out. I am fully bipartisan. I've actually worked more closely with Republican White Houses going back to the George H.W. Bush administration than I have with Democratic White Houses. And I've worked with members of the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle. I am fully nonpartisan. Having said that, my greatest source of optimism, though, is one that goes beyond everything we've talked about. And it is simply that the Biden administration, in contrast with the Trump administration, is clearly embracing scientific and other expertise, whether from the best epidemiologists and infectious disease experts to design effective strategies for the COVID-19 pandemic, or the best scientists, lawyers, and even economists to design sound climate policies that can also be politically feasible. And one of the reasons, more specifically, for my optimism there is that many of those people are my former students at Harvard. And I'm sure there are marvelous people from Yale as well who I know of actually, who are in the administration. So environmental economics is not oxymoronic. I hope that I have justified to some degree that an economic perspective can be very helpful for a full understanding of environmental problems, which I care about, because that means that economic analysis can be key for the design of solutions that are environmentally effective, economically sensible, and politically pragmatic, which leaves me to share two words: thank you. And then to mention what I think is going to be available to you anyway through the chat or follow-up or some way, that if you want more information on anything I've talked about, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, which I direct, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, which I also chair, my website, my blog. I just put up something a few minutes ago about COP26 in Glasgow, or you can follow me on Twitter. And with that, again, thank you, and I'll look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Stavins. And to reiterate, we will be sending all of those resources to all of the folks who have registered for this talk. So you will certainly receive not only the recording, but the links that Rob just shared on his screen. So more to come. We do have lots and lots of questions coming in, and I encourage all of you to continue to submit your questions to the Q&A box, but I would love to get started here because we have many to go through. So Rob, let's see here. Our first question I would like to pose to you, and you did just touch upon this, I wonder if you can expand. Can the US move forward on climate change without additional congressional funding?
So it's not so much congressional, it's a good question. It's not so much congressional funding that's necessary as congressional action. A lot of public policy in the climate domain do not require budgetary measures. That's what's being used because the Biden administration is stuck with that if they're going to use reconciliation to require only 51 votes. Environmental policies typically regulate the private sector, and the government places the costs on the private sector, which then gets passed on to consumers.
Thank you. Rob, can you please discuss the role of nuclear power? Is it essential to reduce greenhouse gases? Is it feasible economically and politically?
So nuclear power economically, and it's very difficult to estimate because so much of the cost of nuclear power in some jurisdictions, I'm taking the United States in particular, have to do with the process of siting. But it's very capital intensive. The cost of nuclear power until very recently were similar to the costs of using renewables to generate electricity. Now that's no longer the case because we've had very significant falls in the cost of renewables. Nuclear power could be, and in a sense should be, part of the solution. It is a carbon-free source of electricity. But in the United States, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in many countries of the world, with the important exception of France, there is tremendous political opposition to the siting of nuclear power plants. You know, no one wants it in their backyard.
Mm-hmm, sure. Thanks. So, Rob, we know that our world leaders, including yourself, are gathering for the UN climate negotiations next week. We have several questions about what will be taking place, in particular, your role. Can you tell us a little bit about what you will be doing?
Okay, I'll give you the short version, but I want to tell you that if you go to my blog at Harvard, I just posted an essay, like 5 minutes before we started, in which I say, what are the big issues in Glasgow at COP26, and what is it that I'm going to be doing? So one of the things that I do at Harvard administratively is that I direct the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, the purpose of which is to help the negotiating countries of the world identify approaches that are scientifically sound, economically sensible, and politically pragmatic. And so each year I take my small team, which is three or four of us, to the climate negotiations. And what we do there is we make presentations in what are called side events. I'll be doing it this year. And in addition to that, we hold meetings. I'll make presentations at the pavilions of countries that invite me to do it, typically China and Korea, the European Union, and others. Then we'll have bilateral meetings with some of the negotiating teams who invited us, who wanted to talk, to find out about research going on at Harvard for us to address their questions. We'll also meet with NGOs, private industry representatives. The climate negotiations, the negotiations are this little small part in the corner. The rest of it is a massive convention of everyone from all different kinds of sectors of the world who are thinking about climate change.
Thank you. And so a follow-up question to that, do you think COP26 will make a difference in reducing CO2 emissions?
Well, so my overview answer is what I mentioned before, and that is that the important thing is that the baton gets passed, that it's not dropped. Will it make a difference? You know, to be completely honest, we won't know even at the end of the COP. Remember, what the COP is doing is countries are establishing targets. The key issue is whether or not those targets then are followed up with domestic legislation and effective policy, and the targets are achieved. Progress is being made in terms of the targets under the Paris Agreement. I gave you before, the list of some of the key emitters of the world, and I think China is going to join with a new, more aggressive target. So it's going to improve things. But if your judgment of success or failure, which is what much of the popular press will use as a criterion, is whether or not the targets coming out of the negotiations 2 weeks from now will put the world on track to limit global warming in this century to the official Paris target, which is 2 degrees C, or the aspirational target in the agreement of 1.5 degrees C. That's not going to happen. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. And so to wrap up the COP26 questions here, we assume that there are other Harvard faculty and researchers attending. Is there any coordination that goes in beforehand? Are you aware of other colleagues that will be joining?
So what we do is people that are working on aspects of the agreement and the negotiations, we involve them in any way that we possibly can. The person who, for example, who was supposed to be coming with us, but because of the pandemic, lots of things are changing now in terms of travel. So I shouldn't mention his name, but anyway, there are several other faculty who are going to be coming because of the pandemic. They're not. I don't know if I'm not very risk averse or I'm foolish, but I'm going anyway. So we do involve others from Harvard. We also involve Harvard students and a number of students from Harvard, from different parts of the university, from the college, the School of Public Health, the law school will be in Glasgow for the climate talks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. To our next question, please explain how RGGI is deemed a success when it has had virtually no causal impact on emission reductions.
So RGGI is pronounced by the climate aficionados as RGGI.
Okay, thank you.
RGGI is, and so it stands for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a consortium of 11 states in the Northeast and Middle Atlantic states who put in place a cap and trade system exclusively in the electricity sector. But the cap is not very ambitious. Okay. And the reason they didn't want the cap to be very ambitious would be if there would be a huge amount of leakage outside of the region. In other words, principally from New York to Pennsylvania. Think about that long border. So what would happen is you drive up the cost of generating electricity in New York. You can import into New York State and via the grid electricity from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania electricity is extremely carbon intensive, high reliance on coal generation. So to prevent that from happening, this is one of the reasons, the program is not very ambitious. Because the program is not ambitious, that means the carbon price is not going to be that high. And the result is, the questioner is correct, is that it hasn't actually accomplished very much in terms of emissions reductions via the carbon price. However, what it has done, and the reason the states love it, it's raised over $1 billion of revenue because these allowances are auctioned by the states to electric utilities. And what do they do with this money? They've used this money to finance various kinds of climate programs within the various states.
Thank you. And that's actually a great segue to our next set of questions. I see several coming in concerning the carbon pricing and taxing strategies. So to this next question, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness and viability of a carbon fee and dividend policy?
So a carbon fee and dividend policy refers to a carbon tax, and then the revenue is used for a specific purpose. Namely, the revenue is refunded. It could possibly be revenue neutral. You say take all the tax money and you give it back to people. Now, how do you give it back? Well, there are a variety of ways you could do it. You could give it back to each family gets a check for the same amount. And if the return address on the check is your congressman, it may become politically feasible, in fact. So that's one of the reasons why I support it, is because it's a politically feasible, a politically attractive approach. I can't go so far as to say it's necessarily feasible. So that's a carbon dividend program. There are other things that can be done with the revenue. You could target people who are particularly disadvantaged. In other words, it could be to low-income people, either through tax cuts or, again, checks, since very low-income people don't benefit from tax cuts because they don't pay taxes. You could also take some of the revenue in what's called the parts of the country that are themselves disadvantaged by the policy. In particular, think about Appalachian coal miners. I mean, Appalachia is essentially a little developing country right here within the United States. It's exceptionally poor, very low levels of labor mobility. So they'll be hurt by a climate policy, whether it's carbon pricing or its performance standards. So some of the revenue could be used for job retraining or direct compensation of people whose employment is jeopardized.
Thank you. Could you please touch upon the role of hydrogen power in the future of carbon-free energy?
So hydrogen power is something that is much discussed, has been for decades. It's getting a lot more attention now, both mainly in Europe, but also in the United States. The big issue, and because when hydrogen is used, you don't have CO2 emissions reductions. Okay, it's just hydrogen. There's no O2 and there's no C. So the principal thing is there's no C combining with the O2 from the air. So it's just the hydrogen. The issue is, where do you get the hydrogen? So one way you can get the hydrogen, is you all may recall from your high school chemistry class, I do, is you remember stick electrodes into the water and hydrogen bubbles up at one and oxygen bubbles up at another through electrolysis. But where does the energy come from? Where did that electricity come from? So if the energy itself is coming from fossil fuels, then that hydrogen, even though the hydrogen may not be releasing greenhouse gases on combustion, the life cycle of it is very carbon intensive. On the other hand, if it comes fully from renewables, it becomes a very attractive energy source. And it's for that latter reason that it's now receiving a lot of, I say, research attention more than actual policy attention.
Thank you. I see several questions regarding offsetting programs and their effectiveness. Can you comment on that for our group?
Sure. So let me distinguish between an offset program, which I call an emission reduction credit program, and a cap and trade system where there's an actual cap and then a set of emitters have to reduce emissions and they can trade to see who does it. But you're going to achieve the cap almost essentially by definition if the program is monitored and enforced as they have been. An offset program is something different. An offset program is that some company faces regulation, either because of a cap and trade system or a performance standard or whatever. And then instead of reducing its emissions, it can go outside of the system. And if it can finance someone outside of the system reducing their emissions, then it generates a credit and they can use that credit. But think about what happens with the offset being generated. The comparison you have to make in order to generate an offset, you have to reduce emissions below what they normally would be. But I don't know what they normally would be. And so there's a question which is referred to as additionality, that this just might be unreal, that the offset might not actually be representing real reduced emissions. And then the company that actually faces a constraint uses that to escape. So we have a net increase in emissions. So this problem of the unobserved and fundamentally unobservable hypothetical with an offset program is a real challenge. I'm not saying that all offset programs are bad. They've got some very good ones operating in California, for example, but it is a challenge to keep in mind.
Thank you. What parts of the world will suffer the most economically from the various catastrophic effects of climate change? And another question, similarly, we have a couple people commenting on the sea level rise and how this will present problems for businesses and communities.
So let me start with the general point and then comment on sea level rise. So if you wanted in general terms to determine where are the greatest damages of climate change going to be, then let's start by recognizing that the most climate sensitive sector of virtually any economy is agriculture. And by definition, the developing countries are reliant for a larger share of their gross domestic product on agriculture than are the industrialized countries. That's by definition, right? So for that reason alone, it's reasonable to anticipate that damages will be disproportionately borne by developing countries. Now, in addition to impacts on agriculture, and that's because of shifts in precipitation patterns, in some cases changes in temperature, but mainly changes in precipitation patterns, there's also the reality of sea level rise. And sea level rise affects any part of the world where there's a coastline. Now, the big question is whether it affects your country a lot or a little depends upon what is the size of the country. If the country is huge, then the coastal areas are relatively small compared to the inland areas of the country. So what's the extreme? What's the poster child? Small island states. For small island states, climate change is not an increase in costs only, it's existential. So I would put the small island states at the very top of the list of impacts of climate change, and then developing countries in general, and then certain parts of the world, including United States, where sea level rise would be a significant issue.
Certainly, thank you. So is it politically feasible that private sector organizations could get together to negotiate a compromise climate program and advocate to government and the public?
Well, the private, something that's really changed a lot, that counters some of the policy pessimism you may have heard in my prepared presentation, is that private industry, at least in words, has changed tremendously around the world in terms of announcing targets for net zero emissions for 2050 is a typical one. In some cases, for announcing what are in my mind much more important, which are 2025 and 2030 targets. We've even seen this from some of the oil companies, mainly the European oil majors, but also to some degree from US oil companies. But it's one thing, of course, to say that. It's another thing to actually do it. And, I can't promise what will happen, but that's been a significant change. But there is something significant that individuals can do and companies can do in climate change. And that is wherever there's a cap and trade mechanism, this is a remarkable reality. You can actually change the overall target that was passed by the Congress or the European Parliament. You can make it more stringent. You just buy an allowance and you tear it up. And that has made the program more stringent. And indeed, law societies, thinking about Dan Esty at Yale, law school student societies across the United States under a previous trading program, the SO2 allowance trading program under the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, they actually spent substantial amount of money buying up these SO2 allowances, and then I assume, tearing them up or putting them in a lockbox somewhere.
Thank you. I'd like to focus the next set of questions on sort of our personal standpoints here. And so this question, how can a private citizen have the most impact personally and globally to accelerate climate action achieving carbon net zero. What are your thoughts on that, Robert?
I apologize. I was looking at something came up on my screen from the chat at the same time. Piper, could you just repeat that?
Yes, absolutely. So the question is, how can a private citizen have the most impact personally and globally to accelerate climate action achieving carbon net zero?
So I think individuals to do something here. I mean, my general answer is usually vote. I mean,
Sure.
and the next thing after voting is get involved politically, because that's where the decision making is going to have to be. There are cases in which individuals can have a very direct effect. I just gave you the example with, buying up an allowance and then tearing it up, in which case you will have reduced emissions by 1 ton per year, which is, it's a remarkable reality that one can actually get away with doing that.
And sort of the second phase to this question, what impact does an individual consumer have in promoting better climate policies and outcomes?
Well, I think it's working through the political system. Obviously, people can, change their own demand for the products they wish to buy, without a doubt. And there are worldwide movements about trying to move away from meat, for example, because beef production and other kinds of meat production are very carbon intensive, partly in the production of the grain that feeds the livestock, but also in terms of methane emissions. And so, there are things that you can do. I could reduce my consumption of fuel by driving less, or buying a more fuel efficient vehicle, or buying an electric vehicle if I live in a jurisdiction where the electricity I'm using is not coming from coal. And that's a big question with EVs. So the environmental benefits, if you will, of an EV vary across the country tremendously. From Colorado, heavily reliant on coal, you buy an EV, you've just increased probably dispatch of coal burning in the state, to parts of the country like Washington State that's heavily reliant on hydroelectricity. So it's a very different story.
Thank you. And so this question, we have hundreds of viewers, of course, from Harvard and from our Yale community as well. And what is the most important thing that Harvard and Yale can do to help address climate change? If you had to pick, your top 3 examples.
Oh, I can give you exactly 3.
Okay, fantastic.
Because, I think that Harvard, and I don't want to speak for Yale, but it probably applies. I think that Harvard University, any research university, affects the world mostly through its products. And its products are research, teaching, and outreach. And that the research that Harvard faculty are carrying out now is going to be exceptionally important, not in terms of the policies maybe for next year or the emissions next year, but for 3, 5, 10, 20 years from now is going to be extremely important. And then there's that other product, which are our students. And, I didn't mention that one of the reasons I was so optimistic about the Biden administration is a lot of my students are in the administration, as they're in every administration, it seems, and they're fantastic. I'm talking both Harvard College undergraduates, Kennedy School students, law school students, PhD students in public policy and economics. And then the third way is with outreach, what we do directly. And the example is my going off to Glasgow for the meetings. Other times it would be going to Washington to testify. Those are our products. That's how we affect the world. And I think that's true of research universities in general.
Absolutely. Thank you. And to this point, we know that Harvard has just appointed a new vice provost for climate and sustainability. Can you talk a little bit about how you might be interacting with that person and what the goals are?
So Professor James Stock, a senior faculty member in the Department of Economics and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, has been appointed by the provost as the inaugural vice provost for climate and sustainability. It's an extremely important position, and it's an extremely important initiative, mainly because it's backed up by real resources. Some of the resources, my understanding, is immediately very significant resources, and then a commitment to development efforts, very serious development efforts at Harvard to raise more funds for this. And the work that Jim is doing is to coordinate and then to lead what the rest of us are doing. So, for example, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, the Harvard University Center for the Environment, all of these are part and parcel of what will now be coordinated and led by the Vice Provost. And I'm also delighted to say that Jim and I are co-instructors. We together teach the Harvard Seminar in Environmental Economics and Policy, which in fact will be beginning at 4:30 this afternoon. So
my gosh.
After we finish here, I'll be going off to the seminar.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I think that we are all very excited by this appointment, and I didn't realize that you'd be teaching together. So that's fantastic. Well, Rob, we have reached our time. On behalf of the Harvard travel team and our alumni communities at Harvard and Yale, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation for sharing your knowledge and research with us today. As soon as you close out of this webinar, a brief survey will appear. We'd be grateful if you would take a few moments to complete the survey. And as a reminder, the recording of this lecture will be shared with you. Previously mentioned, we have an extraordinary lineup of climate change conversations. So if you enjoyed this lecture, I encourage you to explore more engaging discussions. You can find more information in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Professor Stavins, and take care.
Bye-bye.